Captain HFY stood on the bridge of his massive warship and stared at the empty space ahead. His forearms shook as he held the emergency message that had brought him here. The message was from his sister's ship, a colony vessel carrying 10,000 people that had been missing for 2 months. The ship had drifted into the most dangerous place in the galaxy, human space. Every alien species knew the rule about human territory. Never go there. Never even get close. For 300 years, no one had entered that dark region of space and returned to tell what happened. Ships that went in simply vanished. The few that came back carried crews who remembered nothing about their time there, only that they should never speak of humans again. HFY commanded 50 of the best warships in the Catherian Empire. His fleet was strong enough to conquer small planets, but as they approached the invisible border of human space, every warrior felt fear crawling up their spines. The space around them seemed different somehow. Their instruments began showing readings that made no sense. Energy patterns that should not exist appeared on their screens. The captain's sister HFY had been taking colonists to a new world when solar storms damaged her ship's navigation system. The vessel had drifted off course while the crew tried to fix it. By the time they realized where they were, they had already crossed into human territory. That was 2 months ago. The Galactic Council had declared them lost and forbidden any rescue attempts, but HFY could not abandon his family. Now his fleet hung motionless at the edge of human space. Every captain waited for orders, but HFY found himself unable to speak. The emptiness ahead looked normal, just stars and dark space like anywhere else. But something about it felt wrong. It felt like being watched by invisible eyes. Then, it appeared. A single human ship materialized from nowhere, as if it had been hiding in plain sight. The vessel was smaller than even their scout ships, barely large enough to hold a crew of 20. It looked almost fragile compared to the massive alien warships, but its presence made every alarm in HFY's mind start screaming. The human ship did not attack. It did not even power its weapons. It simply waited there like a patient predator that knew its prey had nowhere to run. No messages came from it. No demands or threats. Just silence that felt heavier than any battle cry. On the bridge of his flagship, HFY tried to understand what he was seeing. The human vessel appeared to be made of some dark metal that seemed to bend light around it. Strange patterns moved across its hull like living things. Most disturbing of all, his sensors could barely detect it even though it floated right in front of them. His communications officer's 4 hands trembled over her controls. She looked at her captain with wide eyes that reflected the fear they all felt. The weapons officer had his claws hovering over the firing buttons, but something told him that shooting would be the worst mistake of his life. Minutes passed in absolute silence. The 50 alien warships faced the single human vessel across the empty void. Neither side moved, neither side spoke. The tension stretched until HFY thought his 4 hearts might burst from the strain. Then his sister's voice crackled over the emergency channel. The signal was weak and filled with static, but her words came through clearly. She was alive. The colonists were alive. But something in her voice sounded different, calmer than he had ever heard her before. She told him they were safe and well cared for, but she could not explain more. The signal cut off before he could respond. The human ship suddenly came to life. Lights appeared along its hull in patterns that hurt to look at directly. A communication beam reached out toward the alien fleet, but instead of the harsh electronic signals they expected, it carried a gentle voice speaking perfect Catherian language. The voice belonged to a human male, who called himself Commander Alex Carter. He spoke as if he had been expecting them, as if he knew exactly why they had come. He told them he understood they were looking for their lost people, and that those people were indeed safe. But before any reunion could happen, there were things the alien captain needed to understand about human space and why it existed. HFY felt his world spinning out of control. How could a human speak his language when no human had ever made contact with his people before? How did they know about the lost colony ship? How had they been waiting here, as if they knew exactly when and where his fleet would arrive? The human commander's voice remained calm and friendly as he explained that what happened next would depend entirely on what the Catherian captain chose to do. He could turn his fleet around and leave, taking with him a story that no one would believe. Or he could stay and learn truths that would change everything he thought he knew about the galaxy. But first, Commander Carter said, Captain HFY needed to see some files. Data began flowing into the alien ship's computers, overwhelming their systems with information that should not exist. Records of every alien incursion into human space over the past 3 centuries. Battle reports that defied everything they thought they knew about warfare. Most shocking of all, files showing what had happened to ships like his sister's vessel. Ships that had entered human space by accident. All of them were safe. All of them were protected. All of them had been given a choice that would determine not just their own fate but the fate of their entire species. As HFY stared at the impossible data flowing across his screens, he began to understand that he was about to face the most important decision in the history of his people. The human ship waited patiently while he processed what he was seeing. Commander Carter's voice remained gentle and understanding, but underneath the kindness was something that made HFY's blood run cold. This was not a negotiation. This was not a first contact between equals. This was something far more dangerous and far more wonderful than anything he had imagined possible. His sister was alive, but she was no longer the same person who had left Catherian space 2 months ago. None of the colonists were the same. They had seen something in human space that had changed them in ways that could not be undone. Now it was his turn to see what that something was. The message that reached the Catherian fleet was not what Captain HFY expected from humanity's first contact with his people. Instead of demands for surrender or threats of destruction, Commander Alex Carter's voice carried a strange warmth that made the alien captain's 4 hearts skip beats. The human spoke perfect Catherian as if he had been born to the language, using phrases and expressions that even some native speakers struggled with. Carter explained that his people had been tracking the alien fleet since it crossed into the outer edges of human territory. They knew about the missing colony ship and understood this was a rescue mission driven by love rather than conquest. The humans had no intention of harming the Catherian forces, but there were protocols that had to be followed before any reunion could take place. HFY found his voice long enough to ask how the humans could possibly know his language when no contact had ever been made between their species. Carter's answer sent chills through every alien on the bridge. The humans had been watching the galaxy for 3 centuries, learning every language, studying every culture, preparing for contacts that might never come. They knew more about alien civilizations than those civilizations knew about themselves. The data that began flowing into the Catherian computers was beyond anything their technology should have been able to process. Files appeared that contained detailed records of alien ships that had entered human space over the past 300 years. Battle reports from confrontations that no one in the galaxy had ever heard about. Ship logs from vessels that had officially been declared lost with all hands. But the most disturbing files were the ones showing what happened to ships that entered human space peacefully. Lost traders who had been caught in spatial storms. Refugee vessels fleeing wars and persecution. Explorer ships that had simply taken wrong turns and ended up in forbidden territory. According to the records, all of these ships had been found, all of their crews had been helped, and all of them had eventually been sent home. Yet none of them had ever reported their experiences. None of them had ever spoken about meeting humans or seeing human technology. They had simply returned to their home worlds and resumed their lives as if nothing unusual had happened. Some had even become famous for the new ideas and innovations they brought back, though they could never explain where their inspiration had come from. Commander Carter's voice continued its calm explanation as more files appeared on the alien screens. He told them that human space was not forbidden because humans were hostile or dangerous. It was forbidden because contact with humanity would be more devastating to galactic civilization than any war or plague that had ever existed. The evidence was overwhelming and impossible to deny. Records showed human medical facilities where diseases that had plagued alien species for millennia were cured in days. Engineering workshops where human scientists had solved technical problems that alien experts considered unsolvable. Agricultural stations where humans had developed crops that could feed entire worlds without depleting their soil. But perhaps most shocking were the records of human settlements that had been abandoned to make room for alien refugees. Entire colonies that humans had spent decades building, only to pack up and leave when ships full of displaced aliens needed somewhere to live. The humans had asked for nothing in return, except that the refugees never speak of who had helped them. Captain HFY stared at the files with growing horror and confusion. Everything he was seeing went against everything he thought he knew about how intelligent species behaved. Competition for resources was supposed to be natural. Conflict was supposed to be inevitable. Yet these humans seemed to operate by completely different rules. His weapons officer leaned over to whisper in his ear. The readings they were getting from the human ship made no sense according to known physics. The vessel's power output should have been enough to run a small city, yet it was barely the size of a shuttle. Its hull seemed to be made of materials that their sensors could not identify, and its engines produced no detectable emissions despite clearly being active. More disturbing still was what their deep scans were revealing about human space itself. The region was filled with structures that should not exist, space stations the size of moons, orbital habitats that seemed to bend space and time around them, energy patterns that suggested technology so advanced it might as well be magic. Commander, Carter seemed to sense their confusion and fear. His voice took on an almost paternal tone as he explained that what they were seeing was just the beginning. Human civilization had evolved far beyond anything the galaxy thought possible, but that evolution had come with a terrible burden. They had become something that other species could not understand without losing their minds or their will to live. The files showed examples of alien individuals who had learned too much about human capabilities. Some had fallen into deep depressions after realizing how primitive their own cultures were. Others had become obsessed with trying to replicate human achievements, driving themselves mad with frustration when they failed. A few had even committed suicide rather than live with the knowledge of what their species could never become. This was why human space was forbidden. Not to protect humans from aliens, but to protect aliens from humans. The truth about human civilization was a weapon more dangerous than any bomb or virus. It could destroy entire cultures simply by existing, but there were exceptions to the rule. Sometimes ships entered human space by accident, as the Catherian colony vessel had done. When this happened, humans faced a choice. They could simply send the aliens home with their memories adjusted to remove any trace of their experience, or they could offer something far more dangerous and far more wonderful. Commander Carter's voice grew softer as he explained that every person aboard the Lost Colony ship had been given a choice. They could return to their old lives with their memories gently modified to protect them from traumatic knowledge, or they could stay and learn what humans had discovered about the nature of intelligence, consciousness, and civilization itself. Captain HFY's sister had chosen to stay. So had all 10,000 colonists aboard her ship. They were safe and well cared for, but they were no longer the same people who had left Catherian space 2 months ago. They had been transformed by contact with something that challenged every assumption about what life could be. Now the same choice was being offered to HFY and his fleet. They could turn around and go home, carrying with them only vague memories of a successful rescue mission. Or they could stay and see what lay beyond the boundaries of everything they thought they knew about the universe. But Commander Carter warned them that this choice could not be made lightly. Once they saw the truth about human civilization, there would be no going back to the galaxy as it was. They would become part of something larger than they had ever imagined, but they would also become keepers of secrets that could never be shared with those who were not ready to hear them. The display screens throughout the Catherian fleet suddenly came alive with images that defied everything Captain HFY thought he knew about human history. Commander Carter's voice guided them through a visual journey that began with Earth, as it had existed centuries ago. A world torn apart by wars, poisoned by pollution, and divided by hatred that seemed to run deeper than the oceans themselves. The early images showed humans as they had always been described in galactic records, violent, primitive creatures who could barely manage to avoid destroying themselves, long enough to reach the stars. Cities choked with smog, armies marching across devastated landscapes, leaders who seemed more interested in power than in the welfare of their people. It was exactly what every alien species expected from humanity. But then the timeline jumped forward and everything changed. The same planet that had been dying from abuse was suddenly green and blue and beautiful beyond description. Cities that had been sprawling concrete nightmares became works of art that blended seamlessly with restored forests and clean rivers. The humans themselves looked different too, calmer, wiser, more at peace with themselves and their world. Commander Carter explained that 317 years ago, humanity had achieved something that no other species in galactic history had ever managed. They had solved what he called the fundamental problem, the basic flaws in intelligence and consciousness that led to conflict, suffering, and waste. They had not just advanced their technology or expanded their territory. They had evolved beyond the limitations that trapped every other thinking species in cycles of violence and despair. The records showed human settlements spreading throughout their solar system, but these were not the military outposts or resource extraction facilities that other species built. They were communities where millions of humans lived in harmony with each other and with the carefully maintained environments they had created. Children played in gardens that existed in zero gravity. Artists created sculptures from pure energy. Scientists worked on projects that seemed to blend research with philosophy and art. Most shocking of all were the records of human contact with other species. The files showed human ships arriving at the scenes of alien disasters, offering help without being asked and expecting nothing in return. Human medical teams had cured plagues that had devastated entire worlds. Human engineers had prevented planetary ecological collapses. Human diplomats had ended wars that had raged for generations. But in every case, the aliens who had been helped were asked to keep the source of their aid secret. They were given cover stories that explained their sudden good fortune without mentioning human involvement. Some were told they had discovered new medicines or technologies on their own. Others were led to believe that their enemies had simply decided to make peace for reasons no one could explain. Captain Zexhai watched the files with growing horror and fascination. The scope of human activity was staggering. They had been quietly influencing events throughout the galaxy for centuries, always working to reduce suffering and promote peace, never taking credit for their actions. They were like gardeners tending a vast field, helping plants grow while remaining invisible to those they helped. Commander Carter's voice took on a sad tone as he explained why this secrecy was necessary. The knowledge that such perfection was possible would destroy most alien civilizations overnight. Species that had built their entire cultures around the idea that conflict was natural and resources were scarce would collapse when faced with proof that both beliefs were false. Governments that maintained power by convincing their people that enemies were everywhere would fall apart if those people learned that cooperation was not only possible, but inevitable. The display showed examples of what happened when aliens learned too much about human capabilities. A brilliant Vorthon scientist who had discovered evidence of human technology had spent his final years in an asylum, raving about impossible machines that could create matter from energy. A Zelkan philosopher who had deduced the existence of human civilization had written treatises arguing that intelligence itself was a cosmic mistake that should be eliminated. An entire Thraxian colony had committed mass suicide after their leaders concluded that their species would never be worthy of the universe they lived in. This was the terrible burden that humans carried. They had become something wonderful, but that wonder was a poison that would kill anyone who was not ready to receive it. They could help other species in small ways, nudging them toward better choices and happier lives, but they could never reveal themselves without risking the destruction of everything they were trying to protect. The files showed the current state of the galaxy beyond human space, and the contrast was heartbreaking. Wars that had been raging for generations over resources that existed in abundance just a few star systems away. Species that had driven themselves to the edge of extinction, fighting over planets that humans could have terraformed in months. Millions of beings dying from diseases that human medicine could cure with simple injections. But perhaps most tragic were the records of species that had almost achieved what humans had accomplished, only to destroy themselves at the last moment. The Kathrani had developed technology that could have ended scarcity forever, but fear of change had led them to suppress their own discoveries. The Yalthek had discovered philosophical principles that could have ended all conflict between thinking beings, but political leaders had declared such ideas dangerous and executed everyone who promoted them. Commander Carter explained that humanity watched these tragedies with infinite sadness, knowing they could prevent them but understanding that intervention would only cause greater disasters. They could save individual ships and isolated communities, but they could not save entire civilizations from their own choices without destroying those civilizations in the process. The human commander paused in his explanation and seemed to be consulting with others aboard his ship. When he spoke again, his voice carried a new weight of responsibility. He told Captain Zexhai that the decision his fleet was about to make would be different from the choice offered to most accidental visitors to human space. The Catherians were not just refugees or explorers who had stumbled into forbidden territory. They were a rescue fleet representing one of the most powerful military forces in their region of the galaxy. If they chose to stay and learn human ways, they would not just be individuals seeking personal enlightenment. They would become agents of change who could influence the development of their entire species. But that influence would have to be subtle and patient, working across generations to guide their people toward choices that might eventually lead to the same breakthrough that humans had achieved. Commander Carter warned them that this path would be harder than anything they could imagine. They would have to watch their own people make mistakes that could be easily prevented. They would have to stand by while wars were fought over problems that had simple solutions. They would have to live with knowledge that could save millions of lives while never being able to share that knowledge directly. But if they succeeded, if they could guide their species toward the same evolution that humans had undergone, then someday the Catherian people might join humanity as equals in the great work of tending the galaxy. They might become gardeners themselves, helping other species find their way toward the light while protecting them from truths they were not ready to face. The choice was before them now, and Commander Carter made it clear that there would be no pressure and no time limit. They could take as long as they needed to decide, and whatever choice they made would be respected and supported. But once the decision was final, there would be no changing it. The silence that followed Commander Carter's explanation stretched across the Catherian fleet like a physical weight. Captain Zexhai stood motionless on his bridge, his four arms hanging at his sides as he tried to process what he had learned. Around him, his crew members stared at their instruments with expressions of wonder and terror, unable to reconcile the impossible readings with everything they thought they knew about the universe. Then a new voice crackled through the communication system, and Zexhai's four hearts nearly stopped beating. It was his sister Vexhai, speaking from the lost colony ship that had brought them all to this moment. But something in her voice was different, calmer and more peaceful than he had ever heard it before, as if she had found answers to questions that had troubled her entire life. She told her brother that she and all the colonists were indeed safe and well cared for, but that simple words could not describe what they had experienced in human space. She said they had been given a choice between returning home with their memories gently adjusted or staying to learn things that would change them forever. Every single person aboard the colony ship, from the oldest elder to the youngest child, had chosen to stay. Captain Zexhai demanded to know what the humans had done to them, his primary arms reaching instinctively for weapon controls. But his sister's response filled him with a mixture of relief and deeper worry. Nothing had been done to them against their will, she assured him. Everything they had experienced had been chosen freely after seeing what was possible. Commander Carter's voice returned to explain that they were about to show the Catherian fleet the interior of the colony ship so they could see for themselves what had happened to their people. The main display screens throughout the alien fleet suddenly filled with images that seemed to come from another universe entirely. The corridors of the colony ship that should have been cramped and utilitarian were now spacious and beautiful beyond description. The lighting that should have been harsh and artificial now seemed to come from living things that cast warm, natural glows. The walls themselves appeared to be made of materials that shifted and flowed like water, while maintaining their structural integrity. But it was the colonists themselves who had changed the most. They moved with a grace that seemed impossible for beings who had spent their lives struggling against gravity and mechanical systems. Their faces held expressions of contentment, and purpose that HFY had never seen in any member of his species. Children played games that looked somehow more sophisticated than anything in Catherian culture, while adults worked on projects that blended art and science in ways that hurt to think about. His sister appeared on the screen, and while she looked physically the same as always, something fundamental had changed in her eyes. There was a depth there that spoke of knowledge and understanding that went far beyond anything she had possessed before. She moved with confidence and peace, as if she had finally found her true place in the universe. She explained to her brother that what they had learned could not be easily put into words. The humans had shown them new ways of thinking about consciousness, intelligence, and the nature of existence itself. They had discovered that most of the problems that plagued galactic civilization came from false assumptions about how thinking beings had to relate to each other and to their environment. Competition for resources was not natural or inevitable, she told him. Beings could choose cooperation instead, and when they did, abundance became possible in ways that seemed magical to those trapped in scarcity thinking. Conflict between different groups was not an unchangeable fact of life. It was a choice that could be abandoned in favor of unity that made everyone stronger and happier. Commander Carter interrupted to explain the choice that now faced Captain HFY and his fleet. They could turn around and leave human space with their memories gently adjusted to remove the trauma of what they had seen. They would remember only that the rescue mission had been successful and that their lost people had been found safe and sound. They would return home as heroes and live better lives without ever knowing why they felt more hopeful and peaceful than before. Or they could choose to stay and see the full truth about what humanity had become. But Carter warned them that this choice had to be made by every single being on every single ship in the fleet. The humans would not divide families, communities, or military units. Everyone had to choose together, and the choice had to be unanimous. Chief Medical Officer Hannah Price appeared on the screen beside Commander Carter. She explained that over the past 3 centuries, 47 ships representing 12 different species had faced this same choice. Almost 200,000 individuals had chosen to stay and become part of the extended human civilization. They now formed communities throughout human space, not as subjects or servants, but as equals, who helped refine the very principles that had made human evolution possible. The display showed vast cities that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions, simultaneously, where humans walked alongside beings that HFY recognized as members of species that had reportedly gone extinct centuries ago. Gardens where impossible technologies grew like living plants. Schools where children of a dozen different species learned together, creating new forms of art and science that none of their individual cultures could have produced alone. Captain, HFY asked what happened to those who chose to leave human space. Hannah Price smiled as she explained that they became legends in their own cultures. The captain who returned from the dead zone with miraculous new insights. The traitor who somehow negotiated peace between warring factions. The explorer who came back with revolutionary ideas that nobody could quite explain, but that changed everything for the better. These returning aliens carried with them subtle influences that spread throughout their home civilizations like beneficial viruses. They became more peaceful, more creative, more capable of solving problems that had seemed impossible before their contact with human space. They changed their worlds one small step at a time, without ever knowing the real source of their inspiration. Statistics appeared on the screens, showing the gradual improvement in galactic civilization over the past 3 centuries. War casualties were down by nearly half. Technological advancement had increased 3-fold. Successful diplomatic resolutions had increased 8-fold, all because of the people who had left human space carrying a little bit of what they had learned. There. Captain HFY realized with growing amazement that the humans were not just protecting the galaxy from dangerous knowledge. They were slowly terraforming it one mind at a time, planting seeds of wisdom and compassion that would eventually grow into something beautiful. They were gardeners on a scale that spanned star systems and generations. His sister's voice returned, one more time, pleading with him to understand the magnitude of what was being offered. She had seen their people's children learning to think in ways that would solve problems they did not even know they had. She had seen their engineers working on projects that would revolutionize space travel and make war obsolete. She had seen their philosophers finding answers to questions that had plagued their species for thousands of years. The choice was terrible in its simplicity. They could return to their old lives and old limitations, or they could step forward into something so far beyond their current understanding that their minds could barely process the possibility. But whatever they chose, they would choose together, as a fleet and as a people. Captain HFY looked around his bridge at the faces of his crew, seeing the same mixture of terror and wonder that he felt churning in his own four hearts. The decision they made in the next few hours would determine not just their own fate, but possibly the future of their entire species. Captain HFY closed his four eyes and tried to find some anchor of certainty in the storm of impossible choices swirling through his mind. When he opened them again, he saw his crew watching him with expressions that mirrored his own confusion and desperate hope. The weight of 50 ships and thousands of lives pressed down on his shoulders like the gravity of a dying star. He found his voice and asked Commander Carter how many ships had chosen to stay over the past 3 centuries. The human's answer sent shivers through every alien who heard it. 47 ships from 12 different species, carrying almost 200,000 individuals who had left behind everything they had ever known to become part of something they could barely understand. The display screens shifted to show vast cities that defied every principle of architecture and physics that the Catherians knew. Humans walked alongside beings that should have been extinct, their movements flowing together in harmonies that seemed choreographed by the universe itself. Gardens bloomed in impossible colors, while technologies that looked like living art created wonders that had no names in any language. Commander Carter explained that those who had chosen to stay had not been absorbed or converted or changed against their will. Instead, they had been given the tools and knowledge to become the best possible versions of themselves. They formed the foundation of an extended human civilization that valued every individual contribution while working toward goals that spanned generations and star systems. Captain HFY asked what happened to those who chose to leave, and Chief Medical Officer Hannah Price answered with a warmth that made even hardened warriors feel safe. Those beings became legends in their own cultures, she explained. They returned home as heroes and innovators, carrying within them seeds of wisdom that would slowly transform their entire species. They became peacemakers and inventors and visionaries, never knowing why they suddenly possessed insights that changed their worlds for the better. The statistics that appeared on their screens were staggering. Throughout the galaxy, war casualties had decreased by almost half over the past 3 centuries. Technological advancement had tripled. Diplomatic successes had increased by 800%. All because individuals touched by human wisdom had returned to their homes and quietly made everything a little bit better. Lieutenant Lisa Brooks, working at her station aboard the human ship Nightfall, brought up displays showing the gradual transformation of galactic civilization. The humans were not conquering or controlling other species. They were gardening them, nurturing them toward choices that would eventually lead to the same breakthrough that humanity had achieved. They were planting seeds of compassion and wisdom that would bloom across generations. Captain HFY's sister appeared on the screen one final time, her voice filled with an urgency that cut through all his confusion. She told him she had seen their children learning to play games that taught them to think in ways that would solve problems their species had never even imagined. She had watched their engineers working on projects that would make war obsolete and turn space travel into something as natural as breathing. She had listened to their philosophers finding answers to questions that had tormented their people for millennia. But she also warned him that the choice was more terrifying than anything they had ever faced. What the humans offered was so far beyond current Catherian understanding that accepting it would mean abandoning everything they thought they knew about the nature of existence itself. They would have to trust that something better was possible even when they could not see or understand what that something might be. Commander Carter made it clear that there would be no pressure and no manipulation. The choice had to be made, freely by every individual on every ship in the fleet. Families could not be divided. Military units could not be split apart. Either everyone chose the same path, or the offer would be withdrawn, and they would all return home with gentle memories of a successful rescue mission. One by one, Captain HFY turned to his senior officers and asked for their opinions. His navigation officer, a veteran of 100 battles, spoke first. He said he had seen where their current path led. More wars, more suffering, more waste of everything, precious in the universe. If there was even a chance that something better was possible, how could they turn away from it? His communications officer pointed out that the humans had demonstrated knowledge and capabilities that should have been impossible. They had known the Cytherian language perfectly. They had tracked the alien fleet from the moment it entered their territory. They had shown compassion and patience that no military force in galactic history had ever displayed. If such beings wanted to harm them, would they need to ask permission first? His weapons officer surprisingly spoke in favor of staying. He said that in all his years of service he had never seen technology that impressed him more than the simple human ship floating before them. Its power readings suggested capabilities that could devastate planets, yet it had done nothing but offer choices and show kindness. He wanted to understand how such power could exist alongside such restraint. The conversation spread throughout the fleet as captains consulted with their crews and families, spoke among themselves about futures they could barely imagine. Some chose from hope for something better than the endless conflicts that had defined their lives. Others chose from exhaustion with the galaxy as it was, tired of fighting over scraps when abundance might be possible. Still others chose simply because they trusted their leaders or could not bear to be separated from loved ones who had already made their decision. Hours passed as the discussions continued. Commander Carter and his crew waited patiently, offering no additional arguments or pressure. They simply made themselves available to answer questions and provide clarification when needed. It was clear that they had been through this process many times before and understood the magnitude of what they were asking. When the final votes were tallied and reported back to Captain HFY, the result was unanimous. Every being on every ship in the fleet had chosen to stay and learn what lay beyond the boundaries of everything they thought they knew about existence. The decision had been made not from desperation or coercion, but from a collective recognition that they had been offered something worth any sacrifice. Commander Carter's response was simple and warm. He welcomed them to human space and told them that their real education was about to begin. The human ship began moving deeper into the solar system, and the Cytherian fleet followed, leaving behind the last traces of the galaxy they had always known. As they traveled toward wonders that would have driven them mad if they had not already chosen to believe in the impossible, Captain HFY saw cities that existed in multiple dimensions, ships that moved between stars like thoughts across a vast mind, and beings of pure energy working alongside creatures of matter to tend projects that spanned light years and lifetimes. At the center of it all was a small blue planet where the impossible had first become real, where a species had looked at itself and decided to become something better than everything that had come before. The garden was vast and there was so much work to be done, but for the first time in his life, Captain HFY understood what humans meant when they said they were truly happy. The Galactic Council would record the disappearance of the Cytherian rescue fleet as another tragedy of the Forbidden Zone. They would tighten restrictions on travel near human space and remind all species that some boundaries existed for good reasons. They would never know that their decision was exactly what the gardeners had hoped for, because the galaxy was not yet ready for the paradise that waited just beyond their reach.